When Hannah Stoltzfus stepped onto that auction block pregnant and shamed by her own Amish community, she thought her life was over. But sometimes God works through the most unexpected hands, even those belonging to a scarred mountain man with secrets darker than the Colorado wilderness itself. Welcome to a story of redemption, love, and the courage to choose your own destiny. Stay with me until the very end to see how Hannah transforms from a discarded girl into a woman who defied an entire world. And please comment below with your city so I can see how far this incredible journey travels. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Cedar Falls, Colorado, as Hannah Stoltzfus stood trembling on the wooden auction platform. Her plain brown dress stretched tight across her swollen belly marked her as surely as a scarlet letter. 6 months pregnant and cast out from the only community she'd ever known, she kept her eyes fixed on the weathered planks beneath her bare feet, unable to meet the leering gazes of the men gathered below. "What am I bid for this here Amish girl?" barked Silas Cromwell, the auctioneer, his voice cutting through the crisp October air like a rusty blade. "She's got some meat on her bones, and she's already proven she's fertile." Raucous laughter erupted from the crowd, each guffaw striking Hannah like a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around her belly, trying to shield her unborn child from the cruelty that seemed to seep from every corner of this godless place. "She'll make a fine cook and cleaner," Cromwell continued, circling Hannah like a vulture. "And who knows, maybe she'll birth you a son come spring." "Assuming the brat don't kill her first," called out Jake Morrison, a railroad foreman whose breath reeked of whiskey even at this early hour. "Look at the size of her, probably eat a man out of house and home." Hannah's cheeks burned with shame. Back in her father's house in Lancaster County, she had been taught that a woman's worth came from her purity, her obedience, her ability to serve God and family without question. Now, standing here like livestock to be sold to the highest bidder, she wondered if God had abandoned her entirely. "I'll start the bidding at $50, Cromwell announced, his gold teeth glinting in the sunlight. "50, scoffed a man near the front. "I wouldn't pay 50 cents for that fat cow." More laughter. Hannah closed her eyes, remembering the morning 3 weeks ago when her father, Bishop Ezra Stoltzfus, had dragged her from their farmhouse and thrown her into the back of an English stranger's wagon. "You have brought shame upon our family and our community," he had said, his usually gentle voice hard as winter stone. "You will not pollute our children with your sin. You are no longer my daughter." The words had cut deeper than any blade. Hannah had been raised to believe that family was everything, that the community was her sanctuary, that God's love flowed through the bonds of their simple faith. To be severed from all of that felt like death itself. $40, called a voice from the back of the crowd. $40 for this fine specimen. Cromwell shook his head. "Come now, gentlemen, look at those childbearing hips. This girl's built for work and family." Hannah wanted to disappear, to melt into the wooden planks and be absorbed by the earth below. The baby kicked inside her as if sensing her distress, and she placed a protective hand over the movement. 35, bid another man, this one missing several teeth, but only if she comes with a guarantee she won't run off. "Where's she gonna run to?" Morrison laughed. "Back to them religious fanatics. They already threw her out like yesterday's slop." The crowd erupted again, and Hannah felt hot tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. She had managed to hold them back for 3 weeks, through the long journey west, through the nights sleeping in strangers' barns, through the gnawing hunger when her meager savings ran out. But now, faced with this public humiliation, her composure began to crack. 35 going once, Cromwell called, raising his gavel. Hannah's mind raced. She thought of the baby inside her, innocent of the circumstances that had led to this moment. She thought of Thomas Yoder, the young man whose sweet words and gentle touches had seemed like love until the moment she told him about the child. He had disappeared the very next day, leaving her to face the consequences alone. 35 going twice. A movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. Through her tears, she saw a figure pushing through the assembled men, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair hanging past his collar and a thick beard that couldn't quite hide the jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw. He wore buckskin and fur, marking him as one of the mountain men who occasionally came to town for supplies. "Wait!" the stranger called out, his deep voice carrying easily across the square. The crowd turned to look at him, and Hannah noticed how they instinctively stepped back, creating a path as he approached the platform. There was something about his presence, not threatening exactly, but commanding, like a force of nature that demanded respect. "I said wait," he repeated, stopping directly in front of the auction block. For the first time since stepping onto the platform, Hannah found herself looking into someone's eyes. They were gray as storm clouds, and in them she saw something she hadn't expected, not lust or cruelty, but a deep, bone-deep weariness that seemed to match her own. "Well, well," Cromwell grinned, sensing an opportunity. "Ronald McGraw, don't often see you in town. You interested in acquiring some companionship?" The mountain man Ronald never took his eyes off Hannah. "What's your name, girl?" His voice was gentle, completely at odds with his intimidating appearance. Hannah found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Hannah Stoltzfus. "You got family, Hannah Stoltzfus?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She shook her head, fresh tears finally spilling over. No family." Ronald nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew. Then he turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "This auction is finished." Cromwell laughed nervously. "Now hold on there, McGraw. We got a legal proceeding here. The girl owes money for transport and lodging. She's got to be sold to pay her debts." "How much?" Ronald's question was sharp, brooking no argument. "Well, let's see." Cromwell made a show of consulting a piece of paper. "Transport from Kansas, 3 weeks room and board, auctioneer's fee, comes to exactly $100. It was highway robbery, and everyone knew it. The actual costs couldn't have been more than $20, but Ronald didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch. Without counting, he poured what looked like significantly more than $100 worth of gold dust and coins onto the auction platform. "There's your 100, he said. "Keep the rest for your trouble." Cromwell's eyes went wide at the sight of so much money. "Well, that is to say, sold to Ronald McGraw for $100. The crowd began to disperse, grumbling about the show being over too quickly, but Ronald didn't move. Instead, he stepped up onto the platform and approached Hannah slowly, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. "You hungry?" he asked. Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. "Cold." Another nod. The October mountain air was harsh, and her thin dress provided little protection. Without a word, Ronald shrugged out of his heavy coat, a beautiful thing made of fur and leather that probably cost more than most men earned in a year, and draped it around Hannah's shoulders. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming, carrying with it the sense of wood-smoke pine and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than she had in weeks. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes," Hannah managed, though her legs felt shaky. "Good, we're leaving this place." He helped her down from the platform, his hand strong and steady on her arm. As they walked through the dispersing crowd, Hannah heard the whispers following them. "Crazy mountain man. What's he want with that fat Amish girl? Probably just needs someone to cook and clean. Won't last a week up in them mountains." Hannah tried to shut out the voices, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other. Ronald's coat hung nearly to her ankles, and she pulled it closer around herself, grateful for both its warmth and the way it hid her pregnant belly from prying eyes. They stopped at Morrison's general store, where Ronald efficiently gathered supplies: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, bacon, and other staples that would keep through a hard winter. He also selected several bolts of warm fabric and a pair of sturdy boots that looked like they would fit Hannah's feet. "She'll need winter clothes," he told Morrison, who was eyeing Hannah with obvious curiosity. Can your wife have them ready by tomorrow?" "I reckon so," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he thought Ronald was making a mistake. "But winter's coming fast up in them mountains. You sure you want to take her up there, especially in her condition?" "Tomorrow," Ronald repeated, ignoring the question. He paid for everything in cash, leaving Morrison counting bills with obvious amazement. Their next stop was the town's small restaurant where Ronald ordered 2 full meals and watched with satisfaction as Hannah ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen proper food in far too long. She tried to maintain some semblance of the table manners her mother had drilled into her, but her body's needs quickly overcame her social conditioning. "Slow down," Ronald said gently. "Food's not going anywhere." Hannah paused a spoonful of stew halfway to her mouth, suddenly embarrassed by her voracious appetite. "I'm sorry, I don't usually, that is, I was taught better. When's the last time you ate a full meal?" She thought about it. 5 days ago, maybe 6. A farmer's wife gave me some bread and milk." Ronald's jaw tightened, though his anger didn't seem directed at her. "Eat all you want. We'll get you built back up." His kindness was overwhelming. After weeks of scorn and rejection, this stranger's simple consideration felt like a miracle. Hannah found herself studying his face as she ate, trying to understand what motivated him. The scar that marred his left side was old but prominent, suggesting some terrible violence in his past. Yet his eyes held no cruelty, only a deep sadness that seemed to echo her own. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why what? Why are you helping me?" Ronald was quiet for a long moment, staring out the restaurant's grimy window at the mountains rising in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low, she had to strain to hear it. "I know what it's like to be thrown away." The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had put that look of loss in his eyes, but something in his manner told her the subject was closed, at least for now. After the meal, Ronald secured them rooms at the town's only decent hotel, separate rooms, Hannah noted with relief. She had been dreading what would be expected of her, what obligations her sale might have created, but Ronald seemed to want nothing from her except perhaps her company. "Get some rest," he told her as they stood in the hotel's narrow hallway. "We'll leave early tomorrow morning." "Where are we going?" Hannah asked. "Home," Ronald replied. "My cabin's about a day's ride up into the mountains. It's quiet there, peaceful, no one to bother you or judge you." The promise of peace was almost too good to believe. Hannah nodded, clutching his coat tighter around herself. "Mr. McGraw, I don't know how to thank you." "Ronald," he corrected, "and you don't need to thank me. Just be ready to work. Mountain life ain't easy, especially with winter coming. I'll need help with cooking, cleaning, tending the animals. Think you can handle that?" "Yes," Hannah said without hesitation. Work she understood, work she could do. It was so much better than what she had feared he might ask of her. "Good. Sleep well, Hannah Stoltzfus." She watched him disappear into his own room before entering hers. The space was simple but clean, with a real bed and even a small fireplace. Hannah had grown up sleeping on a straw mattress in a room she shared with her 3 sisters. This felt like luxury. As she settled into the bed, still wearing Ronald's coat for warmth and comfort, Hannah placed her hands on her belly and felt the baby's gentle movements. For the first time in weeks, she felt something that might have been hope. "We're going to be all right," she whispered to her unborn child. "I don't know why that man helped us, but we're going to be all right." Outside her window, the Colorado mountains loomed dark against the star-filled sky, holding secrets and promises she couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow would bring a new life, a new beginning, and perhaps, if she dared to hope, a chance at redemption. But tonight, for the first time since her world had crumbled around her, Hannah Stoltzfus slept peacefully, wrapped in the kindness of a stranger and the first real hope she had felt in months. The baby kicked again, as if agreeing with her mother's cautious optimism, and Hannah smiled as she drifted off to sleep. Whatever tomorrow brought, it had to be better than the auction block. It had to be better than the shame and rejection that had driven her so far from everything she had ever known. In the morning, she would begin the journey to Ronald McGraw's mountain cabin, not knowing that this decision would change not only her own life, but the destiny of everyone around her. The mountains were calling, and Hannah Stoltzfus, broken, pregnant, and cast out, was finally ready to answer. Reshaped, Part 2, Louis Viet Tam Mam Senanzen, to liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần, duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ độ kịch tính không viết, lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau modifier, the first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold as Hannah emerged from the hotel still wrapped in Ronald's heavy coat. Her new boots felt strange on her feet after months of going barefoot, but they were warm and sturdy, a luxury she hadn't known she needed until now. Ronald waited beside 2 horses, a magnificent black stallion and a gentler-looking mare with kind eyes. "This is Sage," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's steady and won't give you trouble. You know how to ride?" Hannah shook her head, embarrassed by yet another gap in her practical knowledge. "We only used buggy horses back home. I never learned to ride." "Then you'll ride with me today. We'll work on lessons once we get to the cabin." He helped her onto his stallion, settling her in front of him with a care that spoke of experience handling fragile things. The position put her back against his chest, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing as they began their journey into the mountains. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, their golden and green canopies creating a cathedral of color overhead. Hannah had never seen country like this. The rolling farmland of Pennsylvania seemed tame by comparison to these towering peaks and deep valleys. The air grew thinner as they climbed, sharp and clean in her lungs. "It's beautiful," she breathed, watching a hawk circle high above them. "Gets prettier the higher you go," Ronald replied. "Wait till you see the view from the cabin." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady clop of hooves on stone and the whisper of wind through the trees. Hannah found herself relaxing against Ronald's solid presence, feeling safer than she had in months. The baby seemed to sense her calm and settled quietly in her womb. "Can I ask you something?" Hannah said, as they paused to rest the horses beside a crystal-clear stream. Ronald was filling their water bottles, his movements economical and sure. "Go ahead." "Yesterday, when you bought me, why didn't you ask about the baby, about who the father is?" He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. "Figured that was your business. When you're ready to tell me, you will. If you're not, that's fine too." His acceptance was so complete, so different from the shame and judgment she'd faced from her own community, that Hannah felt tears prick her eyes. "You're a good man, Ronald McGraw." "And don't be so sure about that," he said quietly, returning to his task. "I've done things, made choices that would make you think different." There was pain in his voice, old and deep. Hannah wanted to tell him that whatever he'd done, it couldn't be worse than her own fall from grace, but something in his manner warned her away from the subject. Everyone had their secrets, their private shames. She, of all people, understood that. They resumed their journey, climbing ever higher into the mountains. The trail became narrower and more treacherous, winding along cliffsides that dropped away into misty valleys far below. Hannah tried not to look down, focusing instead on the sure-footed way Ronald's horse navigated the dangerous path. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the dizzying heights. 8 years, Ronald replied. "Came up here after..." After I lost my family, thought I'd stay just long enough to figure out what to do next. Never left. Your family. His arms tightened slightly around her, and she felt rather than heard his sharp intake of breath. Fever took them, my wife Sarah and my little girl Emma. Emma would have been about 6 now. The grief in his voice was still raw despite the years that had passed. Hannah understood that kind of loss, not death, but the severing of bonds that had seemed unbreakable. I'm sorry, she said softly. Sarah always said she wanted more children, used to talk about filling up the house with laughter and noise. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. Funny how life works out. Hannah felt the weight out of his words, the unspoken implication that perhaps her presence, her unborn child, might bring some of that missing laughter back to his life. It was a responsibility that should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with a strange sense of purpose. The sun was high overhead when they finally crested a ridge, and Ronald pulled the horse to a halt. There, he said simply, spread out below them was a valley unlike anything Hannah had ever imagined. A clear stream meandered through meadows, still green despite the lateness of the season, bordered by stands of aspen, whose leaves shimmered like coins in the sunlight. At the valley's heart sat a log cabin, its chimney sending a thin wisp of smoke into the crystalline air. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property, and Hannah could see horses and cattle grazing peacefully in the meadows. It's like something from a dream, she whispered. Gets cold in winter, Ronald said practically, but she could hear the pride in his voice. Snow can pile up 20 feet deep. We'll be snowed in from December to March, maybe April. Just us and whatever supplies we can lay in. The thought of being isolated with this man for months should have terrified her, but Hannah found herself looking forward to it instead. The idea of a place where no one could reach them, where she could simply exist without judgment or expectation, felt like a gift beyond measure. They descended into the valley as the afternoon light began to slant golden through the trees. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from above, built of massive logs, with a wide front porch and real glass windows. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Hannah could see that someone had recently tended the gardens that surrounded the house. Who's been taking care of things while you were gone? She asked. Tom Clearwater, Ronald replied. He's Ute, lives about 5 miles up the valley with his family. We look out for each other. Hannah had heard stories about Indians back east, most of them frightening tales designed to keep children close to home. But Ronald spoke of this Tom Clearwater like a friend with respect and easy familiarity. They rode into the yard as a man emerged from the barn, tall, dark-skinned, with long black hair braided with feathers. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness, but his smile was warm as he approached them. "Ronald," he called out in accented English, "you bring back more than supplies this time." "Tom, this is Hannah," Ronald said, as he dismounted and then helped her down. "Hannah, Tom Clearwater. Best neighbor a man could ask for." Tom studied Hannah with intelligent dark eyes, taking in her obvious pregnancy and the way she clutched Ronald's coat around herself. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him because he nodded approvingly. "She looks like she could use some of Mary's cooking," he said. "My wife will want to meet her." "Tomorrow," Ronald promised. "Tonight, we need to get settled." Tom nodded and gathered the reins of both horses. "I'll take care of them. You get her inside before she freezes." Only then did Hannah realize she was shivering. The mountain air was much colder than the town below, and the sun was beginning to sink behind the peaks. Ronald placed a gentle hand on her back, guiding her toward the cabin. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you warm." The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Hannah had expected something rough and primitive, but Ronald's home was comfortable and well-appointed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a fire already crackling cheerfully in the grate. Handmade furniture filled the space, a dining table and chairs, comfortable-looking armchairs, shelves lined with books. The kitchen area boasted a proper stove and even a pump for water. "This is beautiful," Hannah said, turning slowly to take it all in. "Sarah had a hand in the design," Ronald said quietly. "She wanted it to feel like a real home, not just a shelter." Hannah could see a woman's touch in the details. The colorful rag rugs on the floor, the curtains at the windows, the way everything was arranged for both comfort and efficiency. It made her heart ache to think of the family that had once filled this space with love and laughter. "Where will I sleep?" she asked, suddenly aware that she was an intruder in someone else's sanctuary. Ronald gestured toward a door off the main room. "Sarah's sewing room. I've set up a bed in there. It's got its own fireplace and it'll give you privacy." He opened the door to reveal a cozy space with a single bed, covered in a beautiful quilt, a rocking chair, and a small writing desk. Afternoon light streamed through lace curtains, and a fire had already been laid in the small fireplace. "It's perfect," Hannah said, meaning it. After weeks of sleeping in barns and hotel rooms, this felt like a palace. "Good," Ronald said, seeming relieved. "You rest while I get supper started. We'll talk about chores and schedules tomorrow." But Hannah shook her head. "Please let me help. I feel useless enough as it is." Ronald studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, you can help with the cooking, but if you get tired, you sit down. No arguments." Working side by side in the kitchen felt surprisingly natural. Ronald was an efficient cook, his movements speaking of years of solitary meal preparation, but he made room for her easily. Hannah peeled potatoes while he prepared the meat, and she found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of domestic work. "How far along are you?" Ronald asked as they worked. 6 months, Hannah replied, grateful he'd waited until they were alone to ask. "The baby should come in January." "That's cutting it close with winter. We'll want to have everything ready well before then. I'll ride down to town next week and bring back the doctor to take a look at you." Hannah's hands stilled on the potato she was peeling. "That's not necessary. I can manage on my own." "Maybe so, but why take chances?" Ronald's voice was gentle but firm. "Besides, Doc Peterson's delivered half the babies in 3 counties. He'll know what to watch for." The idea of a real doctor attending her birth was both appealing and terrifying. Back home, births were attended by the women of the community, with a midwife if they were lucky. The thought of professional medical care felt like another undeserved luxury. "Ronald," she said quietly, "I need you to know. I can't pay you back for any of this. I have nothing to offer except work." He stopped chopping vegetables and looked at her directly. "Hannah, I didn't bring you here expecting payment. I brought you here because you needed help, and I had help to give. That's enough." "But surely you expect something in return. Men don't usually—" "I'm not most men," Ronald interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of old pain. "I lost everything that mattered to me once. I won't take advantage of someone else's loss." Hannah studied his face, seeing the absolute sincerity there. It was almost too much to believe that someone could be genuinely good, genuinely selfless, especially toward a stranger carrying another man's child. But his actions spoke louder than any words could. "Thank you," she said simply, because there were no other words adequate to express her gratitude. They finished preparing supper in comfortable silence, and Hannah found herself marveling at how easy it was to work alongside this man. There was none of the tension she'd felt in her father's house, where every word and action had been weighed against religious law and community expectation. Here she could simply be herself, whatever that meant anymore. As they sat down to eat, Ronald asked, "Do you want to tell me about him, the father?" Hannah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She'd been dreading this conversation, but his tone was curious rather than judgmental. "His name was Thomas Yoder. We were going to be married. What happened? When I told him about the baby, he said I must have been with someone else, that he couldn't marry a whore." The words still stung even after all these weeks. "He left town that night. I haven't seen him since." Ronald's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Hannah glimpsed something dangerous in his gray eyes. "He abandoned you to face this alone. The community believed him. Hannah continued, surprised to find the words coming easier than she'd expected. Or maybe they just wanted to believe him. Thomas came from a good family. I was just the bishop's fat daughter who'd always been too curious about the world outside our community. Fat daughter, Ronald repeated, his voice flat. That's how you see yourself. Hannah flushed, suddenly self-conscious about her size again. It's what I am, what I've always been. I know I'm not the kind of woman men usually want. Ronald set down his fork and fixed her with an intense stare. Hannah, you listen to me. Those people who threw you out, who called you names and made you feel worthless, they're fools. You're strong enough to survive being cast out from everything you knew. You're brave enough to face an uncertain future for your child's sake. You're kind enough to worry about being a burden to someone who wants to help you. That's not the description of someone worthless. Hannah felt tears burning her eyes. You barely know me. I know enough, Ronald said firmly. I know you haven't complained once about the hardships you've faced. I know you offered to help with supper even though you're exhausted and pregnant. I know you're more concerned about owing me than you are about your own comfort. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The conviction in his voice was overwhelming. Hannah had spent so many weeks believing the worst about herself that hearing someone speak of her with respect and admiration felt like a revelation. I don't know how to be anything other than what I was taught to be, she admitted. A good Amish woman, obedient and humble and devoted to serving others. But I failed at that, and now I don't know who I'm supposed to be. Maybe you get to decide for yourself now, Ronald suggested. Maybe that's the gift in all this loss. The chance to figure out who Hannah Stoltzfus really is when she's not trying to be what everyone else expects. It was a radical thought, one that would have been considered blasphemous in her father's house. The idea that she could choose her own path, define her own worth, make her own decisions about how to live. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I don't know how, she said quietly. We'll figure it out together, Ronald promised. One day at a time. After supper, they sat by the fire while Ronald showed her around the cabin more thoroughly. There were indeed books, dozens of them, everything from practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry to works of literature and philosophy. Hannah ran her fingers along the spines, marveling at the treasure trove of knowledge. Sarah loved to read, Ronald explained, ordered books from back east whenever she could, always said an educated mind was the best defense against ignorance and prejudice. My father believed books outside the Bible led to prideful thinking, Hannah said, pulling down a volume of poetry. I used to sneak into the English library in town sometimes just to read for a few minutes before someone saw me. Well, now you can read all you want, Ronald said, especially during the long winter nights. Gets dark early and stays dark late up here. The thought of having access to all these books, of being able to feed her mind as well as her body, filled Hannah with excitement. It was another freedom she'd never dared to dream of. Ronald, she said, as he banked the fire for the night, why are you really doing this? And don't say it's just because I needed help. There must be dozens of people who need help. Why me? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old grief. The day my family died, I was in town getting supplies. Sarah begged me not to go, said she had a bad feeling, but I went anyway, figured her worries were just pregnancy nerves. She was carrying our second child. Hannah's heart clenched with sympathetic pain. When I got back, they were both burning with fever. The baby, too, even though he hadn't been born yet. Doc Peterson was there, but there was nothing he could do. I held Sarah's hand while she died, and she made me promise I'd find a way to help someone else, the way I couldn't help her. Tears were streaming down Hannah's face now. Oh, Ronald. I've been looking for a way to keep that promise for 8 years, he continued. When I saw you standing on that auction block, pregnant and alone and facing the same kind of loss I did, I knew this was what Sarah meant. This was how I could honor her memory. Hannah understood now why he'd been so determined to help her, why he'd paid far more than necessary and asked nothing in return. She wasn't just a charity case to him, she was his chance at redemption, at making meaning from his own devastating loss. "I'll try to be worthy of her sacrifice," Hannah said quietly. "You already are," Ronald replied, "just by being brave enough to start over." As Hannah settled into her bed that night, surrounded by the unfamiliar but comforting sounds of the mountain wilderness, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been standing on an auction block, convinced her life was over. Now she was safe in a beautiful home with a man whose kindness seemed limitless, facing a future that held possibilities she'd never imagined. The baby kicked strongly, as if sensing her renewed hope, and Hannah placed both hands over the movement. "We're going to be all right, little one," she whispered. "Better than all right. We're going to be happy." Outside her window, an owl called softly through the darkness, and Hannah smiled as she drifted off to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to this mountain life. But for the first time in months, she faced the future without fear. She was home.
Reshaped Part 3. Lưu ý viết tạm chim nhìn. Từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ. Hoa Kỳ giống văn dầu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết. Lành mạnh kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Modifier that peaceful sleep would be the last untroubled rest Hannah would know for weeks. By morning, snow had begun to fall, not the gentle dusting she might have expected, but thick, heavy flakes that spoke of winter's early arrival. She woke to the sound of Ronald moving around the main room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and when she emerged from her small sanctuary, she found him standing at the window with a grim expression. "Storm's coming in fast," he said without turning around. "Looks like we'll get snowed in sooner than I thought." Hannah joined him at the window, watching the snow pile up in the yard with alarming speed. Already the fence posts were disappearing beneath white drifts, and the wind was beginning to howl through the valley with a sound like grieving spirits. "How long will it last?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Could be days. Could be weeks." Ronald's voice was matter-of-fact, but Hannah caught the underlying tension. "Good thing Tom helped me stock up on supplies before I left for town." The next 3 days passed in a blur of wind and snow so fierce that Hannah could barely see the barn from the cabin windows. Ronald ventured out only when absolutely necessary to tend the animals, returning each time coated in ice and snow, his face red with cold. Hannah kept the fires burning and the coffee hot, learning the rhythms of storm survival. On the 4th morning, she woke to an eerie silence. The wind had died and pale sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating a world transformed. Snow had drifted against the cabin nearly to the roofline on the north side, and the familiar landscape had become an alien wonderland of white curves and shadows. "It's over," Ronald announced, already dressed and pulling on his heavy coat. "But we've got work to do. That much snow this early means we're in for a hard winter." Hannah spent the morning helping him dig out the barn and check on the animals. The horses and cattle had weathered the storm well, but it was clear that the early blizzard had caught everyone off guard. As they worked, Hannah noticed movement on the far ridge, tiny figures making their way down the mountainside through the deep snow. "Company coming," Ronald observed, following her gaze. "That'll be Tom and his family. They always check on neighbors after a big storm." Within an hour, 3 figures on snowshoes had arrived in the yard. Tom Clearwater, a woman who could only be his wife, and a boy of perhaps 12. The woman was small and dark, like her husband, with
intelligent eyes and graying hair braided with beads. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but her gaze was warm as it settled on Hannah. "Mary Clearwater," she said by way of introduction, clasping Hannah's hands in her own surprisingly strong grip. "And this is our son Joseph." The boy nodded shyly at Hannah before disappearing into the barn with his father and Ronald to check on the animals. Mary, meanwhile, studied Hannah with the frank assessment of an experienced midwife. "When is your baby due?" she asked, without preamble. "January," Hannah replied, surprised by the directness, but somehow comforted by it. "Good. That gives us time to prepare properly." Mary's tone suggested the matter was already settled. "I've delivered more babies than I can count, including my own 5 children. You'll want someone experienced when your time comes." Hannah felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. She hadn't realized how much she'd been dreading facing childbirth alone until Mary offered her expertise so matter-of-factly. "Tom tells me you're from Pennsylvania," Mary continued as they walked back toward the cabin. "Amish." "Yes," Hannah admitted, waiting for the judgment that usually followed such revelations. Instead, Mary nodded thoughtfully. "Good people mostly, very devoted to their families and their faith. Must have been hard to leave all that behind." The simple acknowledgement of her loss, without prying into the reasons behind it, brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "It was," she managed. "Well, you have a new family now," Mary said firmly. "Ronald's been alone up here too long. It's good for him to have someone to care for again." The easy acceptance was overwhelming. Hannah had grown so accustomed to shame and rejection that this unconditional welcome felt almost too good to be true. When the men returned from the barn, Tom's expression was serious. "Lost 2 steers, he reported to Ronald. "Probably more scattered in the storm. It'll take days to round up what's left." "At least the horses made it through," Ronald replied. "We can search for the cattle once the snow settles." "There's something else," Tom said, his voice dropping lower. "Joseph spotted railroad survey stakes on the East Ridge yesterday before the storm hit. Fresh ones." Ronald's face darkened. "How close?" "Maybe 2 miles from your property line. They're moving faster than we thought." Hannah looked between the 2 men, sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "Railroad?" she asked. "Colorado Central's been trying to push a line through this valley for the past 2 years, Ronald explained grimly. "They want to connect the mining camps up north with the main line. Problem is, they'd have to go right through our land to do it. And they don't plan to ask permission," Tom added, "or pay fair prices. They've been pressuring homesteaders all along their proposed route. Some folks have sold out. Others," he shrugged meaningfully, "others have had accidents," Ronald finished. "Barns burned down, cattle poisoned, wells contaminated. Amazing how clumsy railroad workers can be." Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They can't just take people's land, can they? "They can if they get the government to declare it essential for commerce," Ronald said bitterly. "Or if they make life so difficult that people give up and leave." Mary placed a comforting hand on Hannah's arm. "Don't borrow trouble," she advised. "The railroad's been making threats for 2 years and haven't managed to get past the territorial government yet. Could be they never will." But Hannah could see the worry in Ronald's eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he looked toward the eastern ridge. This land wasn't just his home, it was his sanctuary, the place where he'd grieved his family and slowly begun to heal. The thought of losing it to corporate greed was clearly devastating. "Is there anything we can do?" Hannah asked. "Keep our ears open," Tom replied. "Watch for strangers in the valley. Make sure we know what they're planning before they act on it." The conversation turned to more immediate concerns: winter preparations, hunting plans, the need to stockpile firewood and supplies. But Hannah noticed how often Ronald's gaze drifted toward the eastern ridge, and she felt a growing unease that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. After the Clearwaters left, promising to return the following week to check on Hannah's condition, She and Ronald fell into the routine that would sustain them through the long winter months ahead. The work was hard but satisfying, chopping firewood, preserving meat from Ronald's hunting trips, mending clothes and equipment, maintaining the cabin and outbuildings. Hannah discovered she had a talent for the domestic arts that went beyond simple cooking and cleaning. She threw herself into making their isolated home as comfortable as possible, sewing new curtains from fabric Ronald had bought in town, braiding rugs from scraps of cloth, even attempting to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove. "You don't have to work so hard," Ronald told her one evening as she sat mending a tear in his heavy coat by lamplight. "I brought you here to rest and recover, not to become my housekeeper." "I need to feel useful," Hannah replied, not looking up from her careful stitches. "After months of being told I was worthless, I need to know I can contribute something valuable." Ronald was quiet for a moment, then said, "You could do nothing but sit by the fire and read books all day, and you'd still be valuable to me. Just having someone to talk to, someone who cares what happens to this place, that's worth more than all the domestic work in the world." Hannah did look up then, meeting his serious gray eyes across the lamplight. "This place means everything to you, doesn't it?" "It's where I learned to live again after I thought my life was over," Ronald admitted. "Sarah and Emma are buried on the hill behind the cabin. I won't lose them again." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, despite the years that had passed. Hannah understood that losing this land wouldn't just mean financial ruin for Ronald. It would be like losing his family all over again. "Then we'll fight for it," she said quietly. "Whatever it takes." Ronald smiled, the first truly happy expression she'd seen on his face since they'd met. I may be just a fat Amish girl with a bastard child," Hannah said, surprising herself with the defiance in her voice, "but I'm not helpless, and I'm not going anywhere." The weeks that followed brought a parade of small crises that tested Hannah's resolve. A leak in the cabin roof during a freezing rainstorm had them scrambling to save their winter food supplies. One of the horses came up lame, requiring careful nursing to prevent permanent injury. The wood stove developed a crack that filled the cabin with smoke until Ronald could effect repairs. Through it all, Hannah proved herself more capable than either of them had expected. She learned to milk the cow, to collect eggs from the temperamental chickens, to split kindling with an axe when Ronald was away hunting. Her pregnancy slowed her down but didn't stop her, and she took fierce pride in her growing competence. The baby seemed to thrive on the mountain air and honest work. Hannah's appetite returned with a vengeance, and she began to put on healthy weight for the first time in months. The constant fear and stress that had marked her final weeks in Pennsylvania gave way to a cautious contentment that grew stronger with each passing day. But their peaceful isolation couldn't last forever. On a crisp December morning, as Hannah was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, she spotted riders approaching from the valley, 3 men on horseback, moving with the deliberate purpose of people on official business. "Ronald," she called, her voice sharp with sudden anxiety. He emerged from the barn, took one look at the approaching riders, and his expression hardened. "Get inside," he told Hannah. "Stay there until I come for you." "Who are they?" "Trouble," Ronald replied grimly, checking the rifle he always carried when strangers were about. "The kind that's been a long time coming." Hannah reluctantly obeyed, watching from the cabin window as the 3 men rode into the yard. The leader was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the soft look of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors. His companions were harder types, hired muscle, Hannah realized with growing dread. "You Ronald McGraw," the leader called out, not bothering to dismount. "I am. You're on private property." "Name's Vincent Morrison. I represent the Colorado Central Railroad." The man's voice carried the smooth authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I believe you received our letter about the proposed rail line through this valley." "I got your letter," Ronald replied evenly. "I also sent my reply. This land's not for sale." Morrison smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. Mr. McGraw, I don't think you understand the situation. The railroad is prepared to offer you a very generous sum for your property, far more than it's actually worth. And I told you it's not for sale at any price. That's unfortunate, Morrison said, his tone hardening. Because the railroad is going through this valley one way or another. We have government backing, Mr. McGraw. The territorial legislature has already approved our route. We're offering to buy your land as a courtesy, but if you refuse... If I refuse what? Ronald's voice was dangerously quiet. You'll have another accident like the one that burned out the Henderson place last month. Morrison's smile widened. Accidents happen, Mr. McGraw, especially to isolated homesteads during the winter months. Fire can spread so quickly in this dry mountain air. Hannah's blood ran cold at the barely veiled threat. These men weren't just businessmen, they were criminals hiding behind corporate authority. I think you should leave now, Ronald said, raising his rifle slightly, before you say something you might regret. One of Morrison's companions started to reach for his gun, but Morrison stopped him with a raised hand. No need for violence, Mr. McGraw, not yet, but I'd think very carefully about our offer. You have until spring to reconsider. After that, he shrugged eloquently. The three men turned and rode away, but Hannah noticed how they took their time studying the layout of the property, the location of the buildings, the approaches to the cabin. They were planning something, and the knowledge filled her with cold dread. Ronald didn't come inside until the riders had disappeared completely, and when he finally entered the cabin, his face was grim. How bad is it? Hannah asked. Bad enough. Ronald sat heavily in his chair by the fire, suddenly looking older than his years. They're not going to give up. Men like Morrison don't take no for an answer. Then we'll have to make them take it, Hannah said with more conviction than she felt. Ronald looked at her with something like amazement. Hannah, these aren't reasonable people. They've killed before, I'm sure of it, and you're pregnant. If something happened to you, nothing's going to happen to me, Hannah interrupted fiercely. Or to you or to this land. I won't let it. The determination in her voice surprised them both. 6 months ago, Hannah had been a submissive Amish girl who'd never questioned authority in her life. Now she was ready to fight corporate bullies and government corruption to protect the home and the man who'd saved her. My father always said that God helps those who help themselves, she continued. Maybe it's time we helped ourselves. Ronald stared at her for a long moment, then slowly began to smile. You know what, Hannah Stoltzfus, I think you might be right. That night, as snow began to fall again outside their windows, Hannah and Ronald sat by the fire making plans. They couldn't fight the railroad alone, but they weren't alone. Tom Clearwater and his family had as much to lose as they did. So did the other homesteaders scattered throughout the valley. If they could unite, present a solid front against the railroad's intimidation tactics. It won't be easy, Ronald warned. Some folks might be too scared to stand up to Morrison and his people. Others might already be making deals to save their own skins. Then we'll have to convince them that we're stronger together than we are apart, Hannah replied. That's what communities do. They protect each other. As she spoke, Hannah realized she was describing the very thing she'd lost when her own community had cast her out. But maybe that loss had been necessary to teach her what real community meant. Not blind obedience to authority, but people choosing to stand together against injustice. The baby kicked strongly, as if agreeing with her thoughts, and Hannah placed her hand over the movement. Whatever happened in the months to come, she was no longer the frightened girl who'd stood on that auction block. She was a woman with something to fight for, and by God, she intended to win. Reshaped, Part 4, Louis Viet Ninh Zin Nanim 500, to liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hôi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng,
hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đô kịch tính không viết lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau modifier. The chance to test that resolve came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after Morrison's visit, Hannah woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the cabin. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the orange glow flickering against her bedroom window. "Ronald!" she screamed, throwing on her robe and rushing into the main room. He was already there, pulling on his boots and grabbing his coat. "The barn's on fire," he said grimly. "Get dressed and stay in the cabin. Lock the door behind me." "I'm coming with you," Hannah declared, already reaching for her clothes. "Like hell you are. You're 7 months pregnant and those animals will die if we don't save them." Hannah cut him off, her voice brooking no argument. "I can carry water buckets as well as anyone." There was no time to argue. Through the window they could see flames licking at the barn roof, and the panicked whinnying of trapped horses carried clearly through the night air. Ronald cursed under his breath but didn't try to stop her as she wrapped herself in his heavy coat and followed him into the freezing December night. The scene outside was chaos. The entire east side of the barn was engulfed in flames, and the wind was driving the fire toward the cabin and other outbuildings. Snow melted and hissed where burning debris fell, creating clouds of steam that made it even harder to see. "The horses first," Ronald shouted over the roar of the flames. "Then we'll worry about the rest." Together they plunged into the smoke-filled barn, Hannah fighting down nausea as the acrid air burned her lungs. The horses were wild with terror, rearing and striking at their stall doors. Ronald managed to get Sage's stall open first, and the mare bolted past them toward the safety of the yard. "Here," Hannah called, struggling with the latch on another stall. The metal was already hot to the touch, and she could feel her skin blistering as she forced it open. One by one, they freed the animals, horses, cattle, even the chickens from their coop attached to the barn's north side. Hannah's dress was singed in a dozen places, and her hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in her face as she stumbled back and forth with buckets of water from the stream. It was hopeless, of course. The fire had too much of a head start, and there were only 2 of them against an inferno. But they fought anyway, pouring bucket after bucket onto the flames, until Hannah's arms ached and her back screamed in protest. "It's no use," Ronald finally admitted, pulling her back as part of the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. "We've got to protect the cabin now." They spent the rest of the night in a desperate battle to keep the fire from spreading. Hannah soaked blankets in the stream and draped them over the cabin's roof, while Ronald cleared brush and debris from around the buildings. By dawn, the barn was nothing but a smoldering ruin, but the cabin and other outbuildings had been saved. Hannah collapsed on the porch steps, exhausted and shaking with reaction. Her hands were blistered from the hot bucket handles, her dress was ruined beyond repair, and every muscle in her body ached. But they were alive, and most of the animals had been saved. "You did good," Ronald said quietly, settling beside her on the steps. His face was streaked with soot, and she could see the exhaustion in every line of his body. "I couldn't have saved them without you." "Was it really an accident?" Hannah asked, though she already knew the answer. Ronald's jaw tightened. "No, I found kerosene splashed on the barn's east wall. This was Morrison's warning shot." Hannah stared at the smoldering ruins of the barn, feeling something hard and cold settle in her chest. These men had tried to burn them out, had been willing to let innocent animals die to make their point. The sheer callousness of it filled her with a rage she'd never known she was capable of. "They're not going to stop," she said quietly. "They'll keep escalating until we give in or until we're dead," Ronald finished. "Yeah, I know." The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Tom Clearwater was riding hard toward the cabin, his face grim with concern. Behind him came Mary and young Joseph, all of them moving with the urgency of people responding to an emergency. "We saw the smoke from our place," Tom said, dismounting quickly. "Are you hurt?"
"We're fine," Ronald assured him, "but the barn's gone, along with most of our winter hay and grain stores." Tom's expression darkened as he examined the ruins. Like Ronald, he was experienced enough to recognize arson when he saw it. This was deliberate. "Morrison paid us a visit 3 days ago," Ronald explained. "Made it clear what would happen if we didn't sell." "Then it started," Mary said quietly. "The war we've all been dreading." Hannah looked between the three adults, seeing the weight of shared knowledge in their faces. "How many other families have they threatened?" "Most of the homesteaders in the valley," Tom replied. "Some have already sold out and moved on. Others are trying to hold on, but they're scared," Mary finished. "And they have good reason to be. The railroad has deep pockets and no conscience. Then we need to give them something to be more afraid of than Morrison's threats," Hannah said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. All three adults turned to look at her, and Hannah felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing. 6 months ago, she would have shrunk from such scrutiny, would have apologized for speaking out of turn. But 6 months ago, she hadn't watched criminals try to burn down her home. "What did you have in mind?" Ronald asked carefully. Hannah stood up, ignoring the protests from her aching muscles. "We organize. We make it clear that attacking one homesteader means attacking all of us. We document every threat, every act of sabotage, every piece of evidence that proves the railroad is using illegal tactics. And then we take that evidence to someone who can do something about it." "The territorial authorities are already in the railroad's pocket," Tom pointed out. Morrison wasn't lying about that. "Then we go over their heads," Hannah replied. "To the federal government, to the newspapers, to anyone who'll listen. The railroad can buy local officials, but they can't buy everyone." Mary was nodding slowly. "The girl has a point. If we can prove what they're doing, if we can make enough noise, it might work." Ronald agreed, though his tone was cautious. "But it would mean putting everyone at risk. If we organize resistance, Morrison will escalate too. People could get hurt." "People are already getting hurt," Hannah pointed out. "At least this way we'd be fighting back instead of just enduring it." Tom was studying her with new respect. "You've changed, Hannah Stoltzfus. When I first met you, you could barely meet a person's eyes. Now you're talking about taking on a railroad corporation." Hannah thought about that observation as she looked around at the group of people who'd become her chosen family. Tom was right, she had changed. The frightened, ashamed girl who'd stood on that auction block was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found something worth fighting for. "I had good teachers," she said simply, her eyes meeting Ronald's across the small circle. The next few hours were spent in intense planning. Tom would ride to the other homesteads, feeling out which families might be willing to join their resistance effort. Mary would begin documenting the railroad's threats and illegal activities, using her extensive network of contacts throughout the territory to gather information. Ronald and Hannah would start preparing for a siege, stockpiling supplies, fortifying the cabin, and planning escape routes in case Morrison's next move was more direct violence. As the Clearwaters prepared to leave, Mary pulled Hannah aside. "How are you feeling after the stress of the fire, the physical exertion?" Hannah placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby's reassuring movements. "We're both fine. Tired, but fine." "Good. But I want you to promise me something. If the fighting gets worse, if it becomes too dangerous, you'll consider leaving, at least until after the baby comes." Hannah shook her head firmly. "This is my home now. My family. I won't run away." Mary studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that. Ronald's going to need someone with your strength in the days ahead." After the Clearwaters left, Hannah and Ronald spent the afternoon surveying the damage and making plans. The loss of the barn was devastating, not just the building itself, but the winter feed for the animals, the tools and equipment that had been stored inside, the sense of security that came from having adequate shelter for their livestock. "We can rebuild," Ronald said, though Hannah could hear the doubt in his voice. It'll take most of our savings, but we can do it." "Will we have time?" Hannah asked, "before they try something else?" Ronald's silence was answer enough. They both knew that Morrison wouldn't wait for them to recover from this blow before delivering the next one. That evening, as they sat by the fire planning their resistance efforts, Hannah felt the baby kick particularly strongly. She winced, placing a hand on the spot where a tiny foot or elbow had connected with her ribs. "Getting crowded in there?" Ronald asked, noticing her discomfort. "Very. I think he's running out of room." Hannah smiled. "I have a feeling. Mary says I'm carrying like it's a boy." Ronald was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft with old grief. "Emma used to kick like that. Sarah would put my hand on her belly so I could feel it." Hannah reached out and took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. Right on cue, the baby delivered another strong kick, and Ronald's eyes widened with wonder. "Hello there, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes at the tenderness in his voice. This man had already lost one family to forces beyond his control. Now he was facing the possibility of losing another, not to disease this time, but to human greed and violence. "Ronald," she said quietly, "whatever happens with the railroad, whatever Morrison tries to do to us, this baby will know you as his father. You'll be the only father he ever knows." Ronald's hand stilled on her belly, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Hannah, I mean it," she continued. "You've given us a home safety love. You've shown me what a real man looks like, what real strength means. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you," Ronald said fiercely. "I won't let it. But if it does," Hannah persisted, "promise me you'll take care of him, raise him to be the kind of man you are." "I promise," Ronald said quietly. "But I promise you something else too. We're going to win this fight. All of us, you, me and this baby. We're going to build a life here that Morrison and his railroad can't touch." 2 days later, Tom returned with news from his rounds of the Valley homesteads. The results were mixed. Some families were too frightened to consider organized resistance, while others were eager to fight back against the railroad's intimidation tactics. "The Hendersons are definitely with us," Tom reported. "Lost their barn to accidental fire last month, so they know what we're dealing with. The Kowalskis too, and the Martinez family. That's 6 homesteads willing to stand together." "What about the others?" Hannah asked. Tom's expression darkened. "The Webbers sold out yesterday, packed up and left without telling anyone. The Thompsons are talking about it. Morrison made them an offer they're finding hard to refuse." "Can't say I blame them," Ronald said grimly, "especially the ones with small children. This isn't going to be safe." "Which is exactly what Morrison's counting on," Hannah pointed out. "He wants us to be afraid, wants us to give up before we even try to fight back." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, a young man in his 20s riding a tired horse and carrying a saddlebag stuffed with papers. He introduced himself as James Sullivan, a reporter for the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. "I've been investigating reports of railroad intimidation throughout the territory," he explained as Hannah served him coffee and the last of her carefully hoarded sugar cookies. "Your situation here in Silver Creek Valley has come to my attention." Hannah and Ronald exchanged glances. "How?" Ronald asked carefully. "I have sources in the territorial government," Sullivan replied. "People who are concerned about the railroad's methods, even if they're not in a position to speak out publicly. When the barn burning started, someone reached out to me." "And you came all the way up here based on rumors?" Hannah asked skeptically. Sullivan smiled. "I came up here because I believe the public has a right to know what's happening in their name. The railroad is claiming government support for their route through this valley. If they're using illegal tactics to acquire the land, then what?" Ronald interrupted. "You'll write a story and Morrison will claim it's all lies, his word against ours." "Not if I have documentation," Sullivan said. Evidence, witness statements, photographs of the damage. Hannah felt a surge of excitement. This was exactly what they needed, someone with the platform and credibility to expose Morrison's tactics to a wider audience. "What kind of evidence?" she asked. Sullivan pulled out a notebook and pencil. "Everything, dates and times of threats, descriptions of the men involved, physical evidence of sabotage. The more detailed, the better." For the next several hours, Hannah and Ronald recounted everything that had happened since Morrison's first visit. Sullivan wrote rapidly, asking detailed questions and taking careful notes. When they showed him the ruins of the barn, he spent a long time examining the evidence of arson, even taking some charred wood samples to send to an expert in Denver. "This is good," he said finally. "Very good, but I'll need more. Statements from other families, evidence of a pattern of intimidation." "We can get that," Hannah assured him. "We're organizing the homesteaders who are willing to fight back." Sullivan's eyebrows rose. "You're organizing them." Ronald smiled proudly. "Hannah's the brains behind our resistance effort. Amazing what a determined woman can accomplish when she sets her mind to it." The reporter studied Hannah with new interest. "Can I quote you on that, Mrs. Stoltzfus?" Hannah supplied. "Miss Stoltzfus. And yes, you can quote me. I want people to know that we won't be driven from our homes by corporate bullies." As Sullivan prepared to leave the next morning, he pulled Hannah aside. "Miss Stoltzfus, I have to ask, are you prepared for the consequences of going public with this story? Morrison and his people won't take kindly to being exposed." Hannah looked out at the valley that had become her sanctuary, at the mountains that had witnessed her transformation from victim to fighter. "Mr. Sullivan, 6 months ago, I lost everything I thought mattered to me. My family, my community, my faith in people's basic goodness. This place, these people gave me back my life. If Morrison thinks he can take that away from me, he's about to learn just how wrong he is." Sullivan nodded, clearly impressed by her determination. "I'll have this story ready for publication within the week. But Miss Stoltzfus, be careful. Men like Morrison don't give up easily, and they don't fight fair." After the reporter left, Hannah and Ronald spent the evening discussing their next moves. They needed to coordinate with the other homesteaders, establish communication systems, and prepare for Morrison's inevitable retaliation. "You know this is going to get worse before it gets better," Ronald warned. "Morrison's not going to just roll over because of a newspaper story." "I know," Hannah replied. "But for the first time since this started, I feel like we have a real chance. We're not just helpless victims anymore." That night, as Hannah lay in bed feeling the baby's restless movements, she reflected on how much her life had changed. The frightened girl who'd stood on that auction block would never have dreamed of challenging powerful men, of organizing resistance movements, of standing up to corporate intimidation. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her voice and her strength in the most unlikely circumstances. Whatever tomorrow brought, Hannah Stoltzfus was ready to face it. The baby gave another strong kick, and Hannah smiled in the darkness. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "Your mama's learned how to fight." 3 days later, Morrison returned, but this time he didn't come alone. Hannah counted at least a dozen men riding into their yard, all of them armed and radiating menace. She watched from the cabin window as Ronald stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "That's far enough," Ronald called out when the group was still 50 yards from the cabin. Morrison rode forward a few more steps, his face dark with rage. In his hand, he clutched a copy of the Rocky Mountain News, Sullivan's story prominently displayed on the front page. "You made a mistake, McGraw," Morrison snarled. "A big mistake." "The only mistake I see is you trespassing on my land again," Ronald replied evenly. "Your land." Morrison laughed harshly. "This isn't your land anymore. As of this morning, the territorial government has declared this entire valley essential for railroad development. You have 30 days to evacuate." Hannah felt her heart sink. Despite all their efforts, despite the newspaper story, Morrison had found a way to get legal backing for his land grab. "I want to see the paperwork," Ronald said. "You'll see it when the sheriff delivers your eviction notice." Morrison shot back, "But I thought I'd give you one last chance to be reasonable. Sell to us now and you can walk away with something. Wait for the government to seize the land and you'll get nothing." "Get off my property," Ronald said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the yard. Morrison's smile was cruel. 30 days, McGraw, and if you're thinking about making trouble, remember that your little newspaper friend can't protect you from government seizure. All his story did was force us to go through legal channels instead of informal ones. The threat was clear, and Hannah felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the winter air. Morrison had outmaneuvered them, using their own resistance against them to justify government action. As the group of riders prepared to leave, Morrison called out one final warning. "Oh, and McGraw, you might want to tell that pregnant whore of yours to be extra careful. Mountain accidents happen all the time, especially to people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." The crude insult hit Hannah like a physical blow, but before she could react, Ronald had raised his rifle. "Say that again," he said, his voice deadly quiet. For a moment, the tension in the yard was explosive. Morrison's men reached for their weapons, but their leader held up a restraining hand. 30 days. Morrison repeated, then wheeled his horse around and led his men away. Hannah emerged from the cabin on shaking legs, her face pale with shock and fear. Ronald immediately pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she trembled against his chest. "We're going to lose everything, aren't we?" she whispered. Ronald was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was grim with determination. "Maybe, but if we do, it won't be without a fight." That evening, as they sat by the fire trying to process this latest development, Hannah felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She shifted in her chair, trying to find a more comfortable position, but the pain only intensified. "Hannah," Ronald noticed her discomfort immediately. "What's wrong?" Another pain, stronger this time, made her gasp and double over. "I think," she began, then stopped as realization dawned. "Oh God, I think the baby's coming." Ronald went white. "But it's too early. You said January." "Babies don't always follow schedules," Hannah managed between contractions, especially when their mothers have been under extreme stress. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and fear. Ronald rode hard through the darkness to fetch Mary Clearwater, while Hannah labored alone in the cabin, praying that her child would survive this premature entrance into the world. By dawn, it was over. Hannah lay exhausted in her bed, holding a tiny but perfect baby girl who had entered the world fighting and screaming, much like her mother Mary observed with a tired smile. "She's small," Mary admitted, "but she's strong. She'll make it if we keep her warm and fed." Hannah looked down at her daughter's tiny face, seeing in it all the hope and determination that had sustained her through the darkest months of her life. This child would grow up in a world where women could fight back, where strength was measured not by submission, but by the courage to stand up for what was right. "Her name is Sarah," Hannah announced quietly, looking up at Ronald with tears in her eyes. "Sarah Emma McGraw." Ronald's face crumpled with emotion as he understood the gift she was giving him, the chance to honor his lost family while embracing his new one. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Hannah replied firmly. "She's ours, Ronald, yours and mine, and Morrison and his railroad will have to go through both of us to take her away." As if responding to her mother's fierce declaration, baby Sarah opened tiny fists and wailed her defiance at the world. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, 3 people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The war with the railroad was far from over, but Hannah Stoltzfus had something now that she'd never had before, a family worth fighting for, and the absolute certainty that she would never give up without a battle.
Reshaped, Part 5, Lưu ý viết 899.000 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phu phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ độ kịch tính không viết. Lần màn kết thúc phần không giới thiệu. Phần sau modifier The sound of baby Sarah's cries filled the cabin with a fierce music that seemed to push back against the weight of Morrison's threats. Hannah cradled her daughter close, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped her own with surprising strength. Despite being born early, the baby had her father's determination written in every line of her small face, though which Father Hannah no longer cared to distinguish. Ronald McGraw was the man who knelt beside her bed, now tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he looked upon the child who would bear his name. "She's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to stroke Sarah's downy head with one gentle finger. "Absolutely perfect." Mary Clearwater packed up her birthing supplies with the efficient movements of a woman who had witnessed countless arrivals into the world. She's a fighter, this one, born 3 weeks early in the middle of a snowstorm and still came out screaming like a banshee. "She gets that from her mother," Ronald said, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For months, she had feared that her child would be born into shame and rejection, marked forever by the circumstances of her conception. Instead, Sarah had entered a world where she was already beloved, already claimed by a man who would move mountains to protect her. "Ronald," Hannah said softly, "I need you to promise me something." He looked up, his gray eyes serious. "Anything. If Morrison comes back, if things get dangerous, promise me you'll get Sarah to safety, even if it means leaving me behind." Ronald's jaw set in the stubborn line she'd come to know so well. "That's not going to happen. Please," Hannah insisted. "I know what men like Morrison are capable of. They'll use any weakness they can find, and a baby." "Hannah." Ronald's voice was gentle but firm as he interrupted her. "We're a family now. Families stick together no matter what. I'm not leaving you, and I'm not letting anyone take what's ours." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and Hannah felt some of her fear ease. She had spent so many months feeling alone and powerless, but those days were behind her now. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Over the following weeks, as Hannah recovered from the birth and Sarah grew stronger, the small cabin became a fortress of domestic happiness that seemed to mock Morrison's predictions of defeat. Neighbors came calling despite the bitter winter weather, Tom and Mary Clearwater almost daily, but also other families from throughout the valley who had heard about the baby's arrival. It was during one of these visits that James Sullivan returned his notebook once again in hand, but his expression far more grim than it had been during his first visit. "The story caused quite a stir in Denver," he reported as Hannah served coffee and Mary bounced baby Sarah on her knee. "Public opinion is definitely on your side. Unfortunately, public opinion doesn't carry much weight with territorial judges." "The seizure order is legitimate?" Ronald asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sullivan nodded reluctantly. "I've seen the paperwork. The railroad managed to get 3 different territorial officials to sign off on the eminent domain declaration. It's all legal, even if it stinks to high heaven." Hannah felt her heart sink. "So we have no legal recourse?" "Not through territorial courts," Sullivan admitted. "But there might be other options. I've been corresponding with some people in Washington, congressmen, who are concerned about railroad overreach, federal investigators looking into territorial corruption. If I can get them interested in your case." "How long would that take?" Tom asked.
Sullivan's pause was telling. Months, maybe longer. We don't have months, Ronald pointed out. Morrison gave us 30 days, and that was 2 weeks ago. Then we make our own law, Hannah said quietly, surprising everyone in the room, including herself. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her cheeks flush under their scrutiny. But the words were out now, and she found she meant them completely. Hannah, Mary said gently, what are you suggesting? Hannah stood up, pacing to the window, where she could see the charred remains of their barn stark against the snow. I'm suggesting that Morrison's legal papers don't mean anything if he can't enforce them. He's counting on us to roll over and accept defeat because some corrupt officials signed documents in a back room somewhere. The sheriff will come eventually, Tom pointed out, with federal marshals if necessary. Let them come, Hannah replied, turning back to face the group. Let them try to evict families from their homes in the middle of winter. Let them try to explain to the newspapers why they're helping a railroad corporation steal land from hard-working homesteaders. Sullivan's eyes lit up with interest. You're talking about civil disobedience, passive resistance. I'm talking about making this so messy, so public, so politically embarrassing that Washington has no choice but to investigate, Hannah clarified. Morrison wants a quiet takeover. We give him the opposite. Ronald was staring at her with something approaching awe. You want to make a stand? I want to make them drag us out in chains, Hannah said fiercely. In front of reporters, in front of photographers, in front of anyone who'll witness what these corporations do to ordinary families. Let them show their true faces to the world. Mary bounced Sarah gently, the baby's contented gurgles providing a counterpoint to the serious conversation. It's dangerous, she warned. If you resist official eviction orders, what are they going to do, arrest a new mother and her baby? Hannah challenged. Put us in jail for refusing to abandon our home. The optics alone would be a nightmare for them. Sullivan was scribbling rapidly in his notebook. This could work, he said excitedly. A coordinated resistance by all the Valley families with full newspaper coverage. It would be front-page news across the country. The question is whether the other families will go along with it, Tom mused. Some of them are scared enough already. Then we convince them, Hannah said simply. We show them that we're stronger together than we are alone. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as word spread throughout Silver Creek Valley about Hannah's proposed resistance. Some families were immediately on board. The Hendersons, still bitter about their burned barn, were eager for a chance to strike back at Morrison. Others were more hesitant, worried about the legal consequences of defying government orders. It was during a gathering at the Martinez homestead that the full scope of Hannah's plan began to take shape. Representatives from 8 families crowded into the small cabin, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and fear as Hannah outlined her strategy. The key is coordination, she explained, standing before the group with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms. When the sheriff comes to serve eviction notices, we all refuse together. Every family, every homestead, every single person in this valley. And then what? Asked Elena Martinez, her voice tight with worry. They'll just bring more men, more force. Good, Hannah replied, surprising everyone with her vehemence. Let them bring an army to evict families from their homes. Let them show the world what they're really about. Old Henrik Kowalski shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ms. Stoltzfus, you speak of this like a game, but if we resist federal marshals, we resist peacefully, Hannah clarified. No violence, no weapons. We simply refuse to leave. We make them carry us out bodily if that's what they want to do. And the newspapers will be there to document everything, Sullivan added. I've already contacted colleagues in Denver, Colorado Springs, even some national papers. This story is exactly what they're looking for, ordinary families standing up to corporate greed. Robert Henderson leaned forward, his scarred hands clasped tightly together. What about our livestock, our belongings? They won't just let us take everything. They'll have to, Hannah said confidently, because we're not going anywhere. This isn't a tactical retreat. This is a line in the sand. The debate continued for hours, with families weighing the risks against the possibility of success. Some worried about jail time, others about losing what little they had left. But gradually, Hannah's passionate conviction began to win converts. "She's right," declared Maria Henderson, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had already lost everything once. "Running away didn't save our barn. Cooperating with Morrison's threats didn't protect us. Maybe it's time we stopped being victims." By the end of the evening, 6 families had committed to the resistance. 2 others promised to consider it, and only the Kowalskis remained firmly opposed to the plan. "I respect what you're trying to do," Henrik said as the meeting broke up. "But Anna and we're too old for this fight. We'll take Morrison's money and try to start over somewhere else." Hannah felt a pang of disappointment, but she understood. Not everyone could make the choice to risk everything on principle. As the various families departed into the bitter January night, Tom Clearwater lingered behind to speak with Hannah and Ronald privately. "You know this could backfire," he warned. "If the federal government decides to make an example of you." "Then we'll be an example," Hannah replied without hesitation. "Better to be remembered for fighting than for surrendering without a struggle." Tom studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Mary was right about you. You've got steel in your spine, Hannah Stoltzfus." "I learned from good teachers," Hannah said, her eyes meeting Ronald's across the room. The confrontation came sooner than expected. On a bitter February morning, as Hannah was nursing Sarah by the fire, Ronald spotted a column of riders approaching through the snow. But this wasn't Morrison's usual small group. Hannah counted at least 20 men, including several wearing federal badges. "It's time," Ronald said quietly, checking his rifle one last time before setting it aside. "You sure about this?" Hannah looked down at Sarah's peaceful face, then up at the man who had become her anchor in a storm-tossed world. "I've never been more sure of anything." The lead rider dismounted in the yard and approached the cabin with official papers in hand. He was a tall man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who had spent years enforcing unpopular laws. "Federal Marshal William Hayes," he called out, "I have legal orders for the immediate evacuation of these premises." Ronald opened the door but remained on the threshold. "Marshal, what can I do for you?" Hayes consulted his papers. "Ronald McGraw, you and all residents of this property are hereby ordered to vacate within 24 hours. This land has been seized under federal eminent domain for railroad development." "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," Ronald replied calmly. Hayes frowned. "Sir, this is not a request. This is a federal order. Failure to comply will result in arrest." "Then I guess you'll have to arrest us," Hannah said, appearing in the doorway with Sarah in her arms. The marshal's expression softened slightly at the sight of the baby. "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but the law is the law. You have children to think about." "That's exactly why we're not leaving," Hannah replied firmly. "This is our home, Marshal Hayes, our life, and we won't be driven out by corrupt officials serving corporate interests." Behind Hayes, the other federal agents shifted restlessly. Several of them looked uncomfortable with the situation, clearly not having expected to face down a family with a newborn baby. "Ma'am, I have my orders." "From who?" Hannah interrupted. "From officials who were bought and paid for by the railroad. Where in your federal orders does it say that American families can be thrown out of their homes in the middle of winter to serve corporate profits?" Hayes consulted his papers again, clearly flustered by Hannah's challenge. "The territorial legislature determined that this railroad route serves the public interest. The same territorial legislature that's been taking railroad money for 2 years, Hannah pressed. "Marshal, you seem like a decent man. Do you really think this is what you swore an oath to protect?" Before Hayes could respond, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the valley. Tom Clearwater was leading a group of mounted homesteaders toward the cabin, while behind them came several more federal marshals, and Hannah's heart leaped with excitement. a group of men carrying cameras and notebooks. "Miss Stoltzfus," James Sullivan called out as he dismounted. "We're here to document this historic resistance to corporate tyranny." Hayes looked around with growing alarm as he realized the scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just one stubborn family, this was an organized resistance with full press coverage. "Marshal," Ronald said quietly, "you can arrest us if that's what your orders require, but you should know that every family in this valley is making the same choice we are. Are you prepared to arrest dozens of people, including women and children, in the middle of winter?" The standoff stretched for long, tense minutes as Hayes weighed his options. His men looked increasingly uncomfortable, and the presence of the photographers was clearly making everyone nervous. 24 hours, Hayes finally said. "I'm giving you 24 hours to reconsider. After that, you'll do what you have to do." Hannah finished for him. "And so will we." As the federal marshals withdrew to confer among themselves, Sullivan and his fellow reporters swarmed the cabin, eager for quotes and photographs. Hannah found herself giving interviews while nursing Sarah, her words carried by telegraph to newspapers across the country. "This isn't just about one family or one valley," she told a reporter from the Denver Post. "This is about whether American families have the right to protect their homes from corporate greed. If they can do this to us, they can do it to anyone." The images that appeared in newspapers the next day would become iconic: a young mother with her baby standing defiantly in the doorway of her cabin, facing down armed federal agents, while snow swirled around them. The headlines were uniformly sympathetic: "Mother and child defy railroad seizure. Federal agents face down baby in land grab. David and Goliath in the Colorado mountains." The 24-hour deadline came and went without action from the marshals. Then another day passed, and another. The federal agents remained camped in the valley, clearly receiving new orders from Washington as the political pressure mounted. On the fourth day, an unexpected visitor arrived, a well-dressed man in his 60s, who introduced himself as Congressman Marcus Whitfield from Colorado's territorial delegation. "Miss Stoltzfus," he said, removing his hat as he approached the cabin. "I've come to see this situation for myself." Hannah met him on the porch. Sarah bundled warmly in her arms despite the bitter cold. "Congressman, have you come to help Morrison steal our land?" Whitfield winced at her directness. "I've come to find a solution that serves everyone's interests." "Everyone's interests," Hannah repeated. "Including the railroads, I suppose." "The railroad has legitimate development needs. The railroad has corrupt officials in their pocket," Hannah cut him off. "And you know it as well as I do." Whitfield glanced around at the reporters and photographers documenting their conversation. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "No," Hannah said firmly. "I'm done with private discussions and backroom deals. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of everyone." The congressman's discomfort was obvious, but he pressed on. "Ms. Stoltzfus, the federal government is prepared to offer you and the other families generous compensation for your properties, far more than market value." "Our homes aren't for sale," Hannah replied. "Not at any price." "Be reasonable," Whitfield pleaded. "You can't fight the federal government indefinitely." "Watch me," Hannah said quietly, but her voice carried clearly across the snowy yard. That evening brought the news Hannah had been hoping for. Sullivan burst into the cabin with a telegram in his hand, his face bright with excitement. "It's working," he announced. "Congress is demanding a full investigation into the territorial seizure orders. The Secretary of the Interior has suspended all eminent domain actions pending review." Hannah felt her knees go weak with relief. "Suspended for how long?" "Indefinitely." Sullivan grinned. "The political pressure is too intense. Nobody in Washington wants to be seen supporting corporate land grabs right before an election year." Ronald pulled Hannah into his arms, careful not to crush baby Sarah between them. "We did it," he whispered against her hair. "We actually did it." But Hannah's joy was tempered by caution. What about Morrison? He's not going to just give up. Morrison's finished, Sullivan assured her. The investigation will expose his whole operation. By the time it's over, he'll be lucky to avoid federal charges. Over the following weeks, Hannah's prediction proved accurate. The congressional investigation uncovered a web of corruption involving territorial officials, railroad executives, and federal agents. Morrison himself disappeared one night, leaving behind only rumors of a hasty departure for Mexico. Spring came early to Silver Creek Valley that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that seemed to echo Hannah's own transformation. The federal agents departed, the corrupt officials were replaced, and the railroad's seizure orders were officially revoked. As Hannah stood in the doorway of the cabin one warm May morning, watching Ronald rebuild the barn with help from their neighbors, she marveled at how completely her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a frightened pregnant girl standing on an auction block. Now she was a wife and mother who had faced down the federal government and won. Baby Sarah gurgled happily in her arms, reaching for the sunlight streaming through the open door. The child was growing strong and healthy, showing signs of the same determination that had carried her mother through so many trials. "What are you thinking about?" Ronald asked, approaching with sawdust in his hair and a satisfied smile on his face. "Everything," Hannah replied, leaning into his embrace. "How we got here, how far we've come, how blessed we are." "Any regrets?" he asked, his voice soft with old concerns. Hannah looked around at the valley that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had become her anchor, at the child who represented all her hopes for the future. "Only one," she said finally. Ronald's face tightened with worry. "What?" Hannah smiled up at him, her eyes bright with mischief and love. "I wish I could go back and tell that scared girl on the auction block what her life was going to become. She never would have believed it." Ronald laughed, the sound rich and warm in the spring air. Maybe that scared girl needed to become this strong woman all on her own. "Maybe," Hannah agreed, "but she didn't do it alone. She had help from a scarred mountain man who saw something worth saving in her." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their neighbors work and their daughter discover the world around her. In the distance, the mountains rose against a cloudless sky, eternal and unchanging, yet somehow different now, not barriers to be overcome, but guardians watching over a family that had found its way home. The auction block where it all began seemed like something from another lifetime, a bad dream that had led to the most beautiful awakening imaginable. Hannah Stoltzfus had been sold as punishment for her shame, but she had found in that sale the greatest gift of her life, the chance to discover who she really was, when nobody else was telling her what to be. And who she was, it turned out, was exactly who she was meant to be. 2 years had passed since the railroad's defeat, and Silver Creek Valley had transformed into something neither Hannah nor Ronald could have imagined during those dark winter months of resistance. The community that had banded together to fight Morrison's threats had evolved into something stronger, a network of families bound not just by proximity, but by shared struggle and mutual respect. Hannah stood at the kitchen window of their rebuilt home, watching 2-year-old Sarah chase chickens around the yard with the determined waddle of a toddler who refused to accept that anything might be faster than she was. The little girl had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her adoptive father's quiet strength, creating a combination that both delighted and occasionally exasperated her parents. "Mama Chicken," Sarah called out, pointing excitedly at a particularly plump hen who had decided the child was beneath her notice. "Yes, sweetheart, that's a chicken," Hannah replied, smiling as Sarah immediately forgot about the bird and became fascinated by a butterfly that had landed nearby. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard made Hannah look up to see a familiar figure approaching James Sullivan, though he looked considerably more prosperous than he had during his first visits to the valley. His success in exposing the railroad corruption had earned him a position with a major Eastern newspaper, but he still returned periodically to check on the story that had made his career. "Miss Hannah," Sarah squealed with delight, recognizing one of her favorite visitors. Sullivan had never failed to bring small gifts for the child, and his arrival always meant stories and attention from the adults. "Well, if it isn't the famous Sarah McGraw," Sullivan said with mock formality, dismounting and sweeping into an elaborate bow that sent Sarah into giggles. "How are you today, young lady?" "I'm chasing chickens," Sarah announced solemnly, as if this were a profession requiring great skill and dedication. "An admirable pursuit," Sullivan agreed seriously, "though I suspect the chickens are winning." Hannah emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. The domestic scene was so natural now that she sometimes forgot how miraculous it had once seemed, the idea that she could have a home, a family, a place where she belonged without reservation. "James," she greeted warmly, "what brings you back to our little valley?" Sullivan's expression grew more serious. "Actually, I have some news I thought you'd want to hear about Morrison." Hannah felt a familiar chill, though she tried to keep her voice level. "What about him?" "He's dead," Sullivan said quietly. "Shot by Mexican authorities 3 weeks ago while trying to cross the border with a stolen payroll." The news should have brought satisfaction, Hannah supposed, but instead she felt only a hollow sadness. Morrison had been consumed by his own greed and corruption, dying alone and dishonored thousands of miles from everything he'd claimed to be fighting for. "How did you find out?" she asked. "I still have contacts in the territorial government," Sullivan explained. "They wanted to make sure word got back to the families he'd threatened. Officially, the case against him is closed." Ronald appeared from the barn, Sarah immediately abandoning her butterfly pursuit to run toward him on unsteady legs. He scooped her up with the easy grace of a man who had taken to fatherhood as naturally as breathing. "Da-da," Sarah announced, patting his cheek with a grubby hand. "Chicken won't play with me." "Chickens can be very rude," Ronald agreed solemnly. "Perhaps we should have a serious talk with them about their manners." Hannah watched the interplay between her husband and daughter with the same sense of wonder that struck her daily. Ronald had legally adopted Sarah 6 months earlier when Hannah had finally agreed to marry him in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. The formality had seemed almost unnecessary. They'd been a family in every way that mattered since Sarah's birth, but Hannah had wanted her daughter to have no doubt about her place in the world. "Morrison's dead," Hannah told Ronald quietly as Sullivan played with Sarah. Ronald's expression didn't change, but Hannah saw his arms tighten slightly around their daughter. "How?" "Shot in Mexico," Sullivan supplied, "trying to flee with stolen money." "Good riddance," Ronald said without heat. The anger that had once burned in him toward Morrison had long since cooled to indifference. Maybe now people can stop looking over their shoulders. It was true that Morrison's defeat had brought more than just security to Silver Creek Valley. The publicity surrounding the homesteaders' resistance had attracted new families to the area, people drawn by the promise of a community where ordinary citizens could stand up to powerful interests and win. The valley's population had nearly doubled in the past year, bringing new businesses, new energy, and new challenges. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here," Sullivan continued. "I wanted to talk to you about something else. A book." Hannah looked up from where she was setting out coffee for their guest. "A book about what happened here, the resistance, the victory over the railroad, the way you organized the families and faced down federal marshals." Sullivan's enthusiasm was evident in his voice. "Hannah, what you did here wasn't just a local news story. It was a blueprint for how ordinary people can fight back against corporate power. People across the country are facing similar situations, and they need to know it's possible to win." The idea was both flattering and terrifying. Hannah had never thought of herself as someone whose story deserved wider attention. She'd simply done what needed to be done to protect her family and community. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I want that kind of attention again." "Think about it," Sullivan urged. "How many other pregnant women are standing on auction blocks right now, convinced their lives are over, How many families are being intimidated by powerful corporations who think ordinary people can't fight back? Your story could give them hope. Ronald was listening intently. Sarah now contentedly settled on his lap with a cup of milk. What exactly are you proposing? I'd interview Hannah extensively, document everything that happened from the auction block to Morrison's defeat. I'd change names if you wanted protect people's privacy. But the core story, how one woman found the strength to transform herself and inspire a community that needs to be told. Hannah found herself thinking about the young women who might read such a book. Girls like she had been raised to believe their worth came from obedience and submission, who might never realize they had choices until it was too late. Could I see what you write before it's published? She asked. Sullivan nodded eagerly. Of course, it would be your story, Hannah. I'd just be helping you tell it. Then yes, Hannah decided, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. But I have conditions. Name them. Part of any profits go to establishing a fund for women in crisis, pregnant women thrown out by their families' wives, fleeing abusive husbands, anyone who needs help starting over. Hannah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. And I want it made clear that I didn't do this alone. The community, the other families, people like Tom and Mary Clearwater, they were just as important as I was. Sullivan was already pulling out his notebook. Absolutely. In fact, that makes the story even better. It's not just about one exceptional person, it's about what ordinary people can accomplish when they work together. Over the following months, Sullivan made regular trips to the valley, interviewing not just Hannah, but everyone who had played a role in the resistance. The process of retelling the story forced Hannah to confront how much she had changed since that terrible day at the auction block. The frightened, ashamed girl who had once believed she deserved punishment for her pregnancy now seemed like a stranger. That girl couldn't have imagined standing up to federal marshals, organizing community resistance, or inspiring other families to risk everything for their principles. What do you think changed you the most? Sullivan asked during one of their sessions. Hannah considered the question while watching Sarah play with her rag doll on the cabin floor. Finding out I was worth fighting for, she said finally. Ronald showed me that first, but then I had to learn to believe it myself. When did that happen? When Sarah was born, Hannah replied without hesitation. The moment I held her, I knew I would do anything to protect her, and if I was willing to fight that hard for her, maybe I was worth fighting for too. The book, when it was finally published a year later, exceeded everyone's expectations. From Shame to Strength, A Woman's Fight for Home and Family, became a bestseller, inspiring women across the country and leading to speaking invitations that Hannah politely but firmly declined. I'm not a public speaker, she told Sullivan when he brought news of the latest speaking request. I'm a mother and a farmer's wife. This is where I belong. But the book's impact was undeniable. Letters arrived weekly from women who had found the courage to leave abusive situations, to stand up to unfair treatment, to believe in their own worth. Hannah answered every one personally, often staying up late by lamplight, to write encouragement to strangers who had become sisters in struggle. One letter in particular moved her to tears. It came from a young Amish woman in Ohio, whose situation mirrored Hannah's own years earlier. Dear Mrs. McGraw, it began, I am writing to thank you for showing me that shame does not have to be the end of a woman's story. Like you, I am pregnant and unmarried, cast out from my community. But reading your book has given me hope that this ending might actually be a beginning. I am traveling west to Colorado Territory, hoping to find work and a new life. If you have any advice for someone starting the journey you have already completed, I would be grateful for your wisdom. Hannah immediately wrote back, offering not just advice, but an invitation. Come to Silver Creek Valley, she wrote. We have room for one more person ready to start over, and our community has learned the value of giving second chances. The young woman, Rebecca Zook, arrived 2 months later, frightened, pregnant, and carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. Hannah saw her own past reflected in Rebecca's eyes and felt a fierce protectiveness toward this girl who was just beginning the journey Hannah had completed. "I don't know how to repay your kindness," Rebecca said on her first evening in the valley, as Hannah showed her to the small room they'd prepared in the cabin's new addition. "You don't need to repay anything," Hannah assured her. "Someone helped me when I needed it most. Now I'm helping you. Someday you'll help someone else. That's how it works." Rebecca's presence brought new energy to the household. She was quick to learn, eager to help, and absolutely devoted to Sarah, who had immediately adopted her as a combination sister and playmate. Watching Rebecca's confidence grow over the weeks reminded Hannah of her own transformation and filled her with quiet pride. The fund established with the book's profits grew steadily, helping women throughout the territory. Hannah found herself serving as an unofficial coordinator, matching women in need with families willing to help, facilitating transportation and providing small grants for those trying to establish new lives. "You've become quite the entrepreneur," Ronald observed one evening as Hannah worked on correspondence for the fund. "Have I?" Hannah looked up from her letters, surprised by the description. "Look around." Ronald gestured at the papers spread across their dining table. "You're running a rescue operation for women in crisis, coordinating resources across 3 territories and managing more money than most banks see in a year." Hannah looked at the evidence of her activities with new eyes. When had she become the kind of person who could handle such responsibilities? When had she stopped seeing herself as someone who needed rescuing and started seeing herself as someone who could do the rescuing? "I guess I have," she admitted with a small smile. "Funny how life works out." "Funny how you worked out," Ronald corrected gently. "The woman you've become. Hannah, you're remarkable." Hannah felt the familiar warmth that always accompanied Ronald's praise, not because she needed his approval, those days were long past, but because his respect meant everything to her. They had built something together that neither could have imagined alone. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and scarlet, Hannah received news that brought the past full circle. Her father, Bishop Ezra Stoltzfus, had written the first communication between them since the day he'd cast her out. "My daughter," the letter began, and Hannah's hands trembled as she read the formal script. "Word has reached our community of your circumstances. Your book has been seen here, though such worldly publications are not encouraged among our people. I have been told that you have found prosperity and family in your new life. I write to inform you that your mother is ill, and she has expressed a desire to see you and her grandchild before she passes from this world. If you can find it in your heart to forgive an old man's harsh judgment, you would be welcome in our home." Hannah set the letter down with shaking hands, her emotions too complex to untangle. Anger at the years of silence, joy at the prospect of seeing her mother again, fear that returning might somehow diminish the life she'd built. It all swirled together in a confusing maelstrom. "What will you do?" Ronald asked after reading the letter himself. "I don't know," Hannah admitted. "Part of me wants to go to show them what I've become, but another part of me worries that going back might make me feel like that scared girl again." "You're not that girl anymore," Ronald said firmly. "You haven't been for a long time. Whatever you decide, you'll be making the choice as the strong woman you are now." In the end, it was Sarah who made the decision for her. The 3-year-old overheard them discussing the letter and announced with typical toddler logic, "I want to meet Grandmama." And so, in the spring of Sarah's 4th year, the McGraw family made the long journey east to Pennsylvania. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs as their wagon turned up the familiar lane leading to her childhood home, but she held her head high as she helped Sarah down from the wagon seat. Her father appeared in the doorway of the farmhouse, older and grayer than she remembered, but still carrying himself with the rigid dignity that had defined her childhood. For a long moment they simply stared at each other across the years of separation and pain. Then Sarah broke the tension by marching up to him, with the fearless confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and acceptance. "Are you my grandpapa?" she asked solemnly. Ezra Stoltzfus looked down at the little girl, his granddaughter, and something seemed to crack in his stern facade. Yes, child, I suppose I am. Mama says you didn't want to meet me before because you were angry." Sarah continued with devastating honesty. "Are you still angry?" Hannah held her breath, waiting for her father's response. This moment would determine whether the reconciliation was real or merely a gesture prompted by her mother's illness. Ezra knelt slowly until he was at Sarah's eye level. "No, little one," he said quietly. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm ashamed. Ashamed that I let my pride keep me from knowing such a wonderful granddaughter." Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes at her father's admission. She had never heard him admit to being wrong about anything, let alone express shame for his actions. The week that followed was both healing and challenging. Hannah's mother, though weakened by illness, was overjoyed to meet Sarah and to see how well her daughter had fared. The other members of the community were more reserved, clearly struggling to reconcile the modest, obedient girl they remembered with the confident woman who had written a best-selling book and defied federal authorities. But it was the conversation with her father on the last evening of their visit that brought the deepest resolution. "I was wrong," Ezra said simply as they sat together on the porch where Hannah had spent so many childhood evenings. "I thought I was protecting our community by casting you out, but I was only protecting my own pride." "You were doing what you thought was right," Hannah replied, surprised to find she could speak of it without anger. "No," Ezra shook his head. "I was doing what was easy. What was right would have been finding a way to help you, to support you through your crisis. Instead, I added to your shame and pain." Hannah looked out across the familiar fields where she had played as a child, feeling the weight of old hurts finally beginning to lift. "I forgave you long ago, Papa. I had to for my own peace. But can you forgive an old fool's request for a place in his granddaughter's life?" The hope in his voice was heartbreaking, and Hannah realized that her father had been punishing himself for years with the knowledge of what he'd lost. "Sarah needs to know where she came from," Hannah said carefully. "All of where she came from. If you want to be part of her life, to write to her and visit when you can. I think that would be good for both of you." The relief on her father's face was answer enough. The journey back to Colorado was quieter than the trip east, but filled with a different kind of peace. Hannah had made her peace with the past, reclaimed the parts of her heritage worth keeping, and established boundaries that would protect the life she'd built. "Any regrets?" Ronald asked as they crested the final ridge and Silver Creek Valley spread out before them. Hannah looked down at their home, the rebuilt cabin, the new barn, the thriving community that had grown up around them, and felt nothing but gratitude for the winding path that had brought her here. "Only one," she said, echoing words she'd spoken years before. "What's that?" Hannah smiled as Sarah pointed excitedly at the familiar landmarks below. "I wish I could tell every woman standing on an auction block somewhere that this isn't the end of her story. It's just the beginning of her real life." Ronald reached over and took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy intimacy of a couple who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. "Maybe that's what the next book should be about," he suggested. "All the women you've helped, all the new beginnings that started with endings." Hannah considered the idea as their wagon rolled down into the valley toward home and the future they would continue building together. Perhaps Ronald was right. Perhaps her story wasn't finished yet. It was simply ready for its next chapter. And like everything else in her remarkable life, she would write that chapter on her own terms, with love and courage and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged.